How does Helaena Targaryen die? House of the Dragon spoilers, spoiler warning. Before we begin, this video contains major spoilers for House of the Dragon, including Helaena Targaryen's eventual fate and events from George R.R. Martin's Fire and Blood. If you don't want to know what happens to Helaena, this is your warning. But if you're ready for one of the most tragic stories in the Dance of the Dragons, let's get into it. Helaena Targaryen is one of the most unusual characters in House of the Dragon. She isn't obsessed with the Iron Throne, she isn't hungry for political power. And unlike many of the other Targaryens, Helaena seems deeply uncomfortable with violence. But there is something very different about Helaena. She is a dreamer. Her strange visions have allowed her to see things that other characters simply cannot see. And by Season 3, those visions have become one of the most important parts of her story. But despite seemingly knowing what is coming, Helaena cannot escape her own fate. So, how does Helaena Targaryen actually die? The answer is devastating. In Fire and Blood, Helaena eventually takes her own life by jumping from a window in Maegor's Holdfast. She falls to her death on the spikes below. But the real tragedy isn't simply how she dies, it's why she reaches that point. Helena's life begins falling apart after the murder of her son, Prince Jaehaerys. In the infamous blood and cheese incident, Helaena is forced into an impossible decision. Her children are threatened, and she is told to identify which child should die. She chooses Maegor, believing that because he is younger, he may not fully understand what is happening. But blood kills Jaehaerys instead. That moment destroys Helaena emotionally, and her suffering doesn't end there. She becomes increasingly isolated and depressed. She struggles to eat, she struggles to care for herself, and she becomes almost completely withdrawn from the world around her. This is extremely important because Helaena isn't simply another casualty of the dance. She represents the human cost of the war. Every time the Greens and Blacks make another political move, ordinary people suffer, and Helaena suffers more than almost anyone. Then comes another devastating event: Maegor. In the book, Maegor is eventually separated from his family and taken away from King's Landing. He dies at Bitterbridge in an incredibly brutal sequence. His death becomes another devastating blow to Helaena. And according to the historical account presented in Fire and Blood, Helaena eventually hears about Maegor's death. Her grief and guilt become unbearable. Soon afterward, she dies. Helaena jumps from a window in Maegor's Holdfast. She is only 21 years old, and her death has enormous consequences, because Helaena is beloved by the people of King's Landing. When news spreads that she has died, rumors immediately begin circulating. Some people believe that Rhaenyra was responsible. Others believe Helena was murdered. The truth becomes almost irrelevant. The people of King's Landing are furious, and Helena's death becomes one of the sparks that eventually leads to the famous uprising against Rhaenyra. This is where the story becomes even more tragic. Helena's death doesn't just destroy her family, it helps destroy Rhaenyra's rule. The anger of the small folk grows, the city becomes increasingly unstable, and eventually the people turn against the dragons themselves. This leads toward one of the most shocking events in the entire Dance of the Dragons, the storming of the Dragon Pit. The small folk of King's Landing rise up against the Targaryens and their dragons, and several dragons are killed. So Helena's death becomes connected to the destruction of one of the greatest symbols of Targaryen power. But there is an important difference between the book and the television adaptation. House of the Dragon has already changed several aspects of Helena's storyline. The series has made her prophetic abilities much more central. Season 3 has especially expanded her visions. We see Helaena experiencing disturbing images of the future, including visions involving dragons, war, death, and the destruction that is coming. Her connection with Dreamfyre has also become much more important. And this creates an interesting question. Will the show recreate Helena's death exactly as it happens in Fire and Blood? The book gives us one version, but House of the Dragon has already shown that it isn't afraid to change the details. The biggest example is Maegor. In the book, Maegor's death at Bitterbridge is one of the major events that pushes Helaena towards suicide. The television series has handled Maegor differently, and Season 3 has incorporated his existence into Helena's visions and storyline in its own way. That means we shouldn't assume that every detail from the book will happen exactly the same way on screen. But the destination is still extremely important. Helena's story is moving toward tragedy. And there is another fascinating possibility. Because Helena is a dreamer, some fans have wondered whether she actually knows how she is going to die. Think about that for a moment. What if Helena has already seen her own future? What if the strange things she says throughout the series aren't random? What if she knows that the dance will destroy her family, her children, and eventually herself? That would make her story even more heartbreaking. Because while other characters are fighting to change the future, Helena may already know that some events cannot be avoided. Her visions don't necessarily give her the power to stop the future. They may simply allow her to see it. And that is one of the darkest ideas in the Targaryen story. Knowing what is coming doesn't mean you can prevent it. Helena is also different from characters like Daemon, Aemond, and Rhaenyra. They respond to danger with action. They fight, they manipulate, they use dragons. Helena reacts differently. She sees the horror of what is happening and becomes increasingly overwhelmed by it. The war takes away her children. It destroys her family. It turns the people around her against each other. And eventually, she becomes one of its greatest victims. There is also an important connection between Helena and Dreamfyre. In the book, when Helena dies, Dreamfyre reacts violently. The dragon suddenly becomes agitated and breaks free of some of her chains. Later, when the dragon pit is attacked, Dreamfyre becomes part of the horrifying destruction that follows. So Helena's death isn't simply the death of a Targaryen princess. It is another step toward the destruction of the dragons themselves. The irony is incredible. The Targaryens believe dragons make them powerful. But the dance of the dragons ultimately destroys many of those dragons. And Helena's death becomes one of the events that pushes King's Landing toward open rebellion. That is why her fate matters so much. She isn't just a character who dies. Her death changes the political situation. It changes the mood of King's Landing. It affects Rhaenyra's position. And it helps push the story toward the collapse of the Targaryen regime. So, will House of the Dragon show Helena jumping from the window? The book strongly points in that direction. But the series has already changed enough of her story that the exact circumstances could be different. What seems much more important is the emotional destination. Helena's visions have been warning us that something terrible is coming. Her family continues moving toward war. Her children become victims of the conflict. And eventually, Helena herself becomes one of its greatest casualties. That makes her story one of the saddest in the entire Dance of the Dragons. She never truly wanted the throne. She never wanted the war. She never wanted to become part of the political game. And yet, she becomes one of the people most destroyed by it. And perhaps the most heartbreaking part is that Helena may have seen it coming all along. So now, the big question is, will Helena's death happen exactly like it does in Fire and Blood? Or will House of the Dragon give her a completely different final chapter? And if Helena really can see the future, did she already see her own death? Let me know what you think in the comments. Do you believe Helena will die by suicide? Or do you think the show will change her fate? And what do you think her final vision actually means? If you enjoyed this House of the Dragon spoiler breakdown, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Because the Dance of the Dragons is only getting darker, and Helena's story may be one of the most tragic endings still waiting to happen.